So we've seen the basic if, which lets us choose to do something or completely skip it. And we've seen the two-way branch that allows us to do something, option A, or do something, option B. And we have to be choosing between one of those two options. This next kind of conditional statement allows us to choose between more than two alternatives. So it's a great general purpose statement that you can use if you have lots of alternatives to consider, or if you maybe only want to do something in some cases, or an option B in other cases, and then have an option C where you do nothing. All of those are possible with the multi-way branch. The syntax looks like this. It starts out with the if and the condition, just like all of the other if statements that we've seen so far. We'll have a body that goes along with the condition and represents the things that should happen if this condition is true. But now, rather than just having an else option, we'll have an if. That's short for else if. This group of statements will execute if the second condition is true. An if statement always has to have a condition that's associated with it. Basically, what you're saying is, if this is true, do body 1. Otherwise, if this is true, condition 2 is true, then do body 2. Otherwise, if condition 3 is true, do body 3, and so forth. You can have as many options as you want. And then finally, you can have an optional case where we have an else that happens if none of the conditions were true. And you can include this or not include it in your multi-way branch statement. It makes the statement really flexible so that it applies to lots of different scenarios. The way this works is that only one of these options is going to execute. So when we look at the multi-way branch, we have all these different pathways that are alternatives, and only one pathway is going to execute. So whatever the first condition that evaluates to true is, that's the body that's going to execute. Once that condition's true, everything else in the syntax is skipped. If the first condition's true, option A, the body number 1 will execute. The first condition's false, then we'll move on and evaluate the second condition. If that condition's true, body 2 executes, and everything else in there is skipped, even if some of these other conditions might also be true. So you have to think carefully. Remember, you always execute the body associated with the first condition that turns out to be true. So what that looks like pictorially is you evaluate your first condition. It's always either going to have a true answer or a false answer. If it's true, you execute the block of statements associated with that first if, and then you continue on with the rest of the program. Notice that when that happens, you never consider any of the other conditions. You just execute that first group, option A, body 1, and then continue on with the rest of the program. If the first condition's false, then you go on to evaluate condition true and ask whether it's true or false. If it's true, you execute its block of statements, that's body 2, and then continue on with the rest of the program, and never consider any of the other options. You only get to the next option if all of the previous option conditions were false. And then if you include a default else statement, that happens if all of the conditions evaluated to false, then that last group of statements, the ones that are associated with the else colon, those execute before continuing on with the rest of the program. Let's look at some example code with our temperature program. Suppose that we want to choose between one of 3 messages that prints out. Suppose if it's really cold outside, we want to print it's super cold outside, bundle up. If it's kind of like moderate, then we want to print a message saying temperature's moderate, you might need a light jacket. And then otherwise, if it's hot, we're going to print it's nice and warm today. So we're choosing to do one of these 3 options, and realize that we don't want all of the options to print out. We want it to be a mutually exclusive situation where it either chooses option A or option B or the default else option C. What happens if the user enters 20? The user enters 20, then it's going to evaluate this first if condition, always looks at that first, and says, is 20 less than 32? And it is. So it's going to print, it's super cold outside today, bundle up. And because this if condition executed, it's never going to look at any of the other ones. So even though 32 is also less than 70, it's not going to print the temperature is moderate and you might need a light jacket. It's only going to execute the first group of statements it encounters that's associated with a true condition. Suppose that the user runs the program again and enters a 90. First, it's going to check to see is 90 less than 32. And we know that's false. So it's not going to do this first group. It's going to move on to the next conditional statement. So now it's saying, else if is the temperature less than 70? And again, that answer is false. It's not less than 70. So it's going to skip all the statements that are associated with that else if and just move on to this final else. The final else doesn't have a condition that's associated with it, so it's always going to execute if none of the previous options were triggered. So in this case, it's going to print, it's nice and warm today, which is definitely true if it's 90 degrees. Our last example, suppose the user enters 32 exactly. So the computer's going to check to see is 32 less than 32, and that's false. So we're not going to do this first block. Is 32 less than 70? That is true. So in this case, it's going to do all the statements that are associated with this else if block. And there's two things that it'll print out. It'll print out the temperature is moderate, and then it'll print you might need a light jacket. I forgot my periods in there. And then because this else if executed, it's going to continue on with the rest of the program. It's going to skip over this else. It doesn't need to do that because it's already executed one of the previous alternatives. So the multi-way branch, again, is really useful for building flexible conditional statements. You can allow it to have lots of different options to choose between. You could have 3, you could have 4, you could have 123 options. And it's also good because it allows you to program in this default case if you want to. You can also skip it. So we could have a program that, for example, just printed a message if the temperature was less than 32 and if the temperature was less than 70, and didn't have an option where it printed anything at all if the temperature was 70 or above. So you can build lots of different kinds of statements with the multi-way branch.